So we've now got rid of the screen. I might write some words on the board if the spirit takes me. Go back to Li Zhiting, the Chinese scholar who attacked Mark Elliott and the other new Qing historians. The point that Mark and his colleagues is making, they're very serious historians, and you can go and read their more extended academic work, is that the world that we know as China today is one with a very complex lineage. It is one, in particular, the Qing period, the period from the 1640s to the 1910s, is one where the Qing dynasty was engaged with world history. It wasn't unique, it wasn't isolated from the rest of the world, it was not a sealed empire, an unchanging, immutable empire. It was expansionist, it was innovative, creative, it employed Confucian ideas as well as Manchu ideas about shamanism. It incorporated Tibetan Buddhist beliefs into its system. Its main languages, its national language was Manchu, it wasn't Chinese. Chinese, the Guoyu, so-called national language, was Manchu. Chinese was a court language and very important, but so was Manchu. It's not until the last 30 years or so that scholars have seriously started looking at all the Manchu documents. So China, the Qing era, was far more open and complex and nuanced. It was led by a coalition of peoples that contradicts very much what the official Chinese story about the Qing period is today. And that's where the problem is. The problem with Li Zhiting and others is they like this narrative that China is a unified nation brought low by Western powers, undermined by that eventually, after years of searching, finds the correct political model for its modernization, which is a form of Marxism, Leninism adjusted to Chinese reality by Mao Zedong and his thinkers in the 1930s and 40s. That has led to China being a strong, independent, and now increasingly powerful country, and has led to the revival of what's called the Zhonghua Minzu, the Chinese nation. Now, all of these aspects of debate about China are problematic, but they're not wrong in simple terms, but they're wrong in their particulars. We don't have time to go into all of the details, but as I've been making the point today is that history and background of China is far more complex than you'll usually be led to believe. It is, we are very much, as I said, in thrall of what the official Chinese world teaches us as the China story. That's the narrative of China in modern times, the Zhongguo de Gushe that we respond to with our ways of talking about it. And it's a story that relies in China increasingly on what I have called over the years translated China. That is, the People's Republic of China has a powerful propaganda bureaucracy, part of whose aim is to present the Chinese story to the rest of the world in language and using ideas that both conform to Chinese ideology and help promote a view of China that supports the one-party state in the People's Republic. Completely reasonable, except when you're in a country or a state or a place like China, this vibrant, complex, extraordinary civilization, when you don't get clear and clarion opposing voices or debate or difference or true pluralism, you end up with a silent, dull, monolithic tale that is more lie than it is truth. And that's the problem one has with any government that behaves like the Chinese government. And I can assure you, nearly every government would like to behave like the government of the People's Republic. Nearly every government, in particular in this security era, this era of hyperbolic hysteria about ISIL and local Muslim fanatics and threats to our societies. In this era, many governments would love to tell a unified, coherent, and enforceable story about themselves and their countries. Thankfully, so far they can't do that. The People's Republic has been trying to do it and does it fairly successfully. Less so in the last 20 years, more so under Xi Jinping. So that's why I'm going to go back in a bit of time and tell you a bit about the China story as it's constructed, because as you work in the next few weeks with the colleagues at, in the Two China program, discussing the One Belt, One Road, these historical underpinnings, this narrative about China does matter. It's a narrative, as I've said, a story that is constructed on the basis of a certain ideology, and it serves very powerful ideological as well as economic and political purposes. Therefore, you have to understand it. If you're taken in by it, and you believe it, and you regard the China story as being the correct story about China, well, all I can say is more fool you. But you've been warned. So the Qing period, we won't go into 1644. Let's just say the Qing dynasty is established in the 1640s. Beijing is the capital. Unfortunate things happen that, again, the Chinese would like to ignore. Late 1640s, early 1650s, the Manchu rulers expel all non-Manchus from the city and force them to go and live in the south of Beijing. They enforce a strict code of apartheid in China for 200 years. One of those inconvenient truths, doesn't really fit in with my longer story, just thought I'd mention it to annoy everybody, particularly probably the Chinese colleagues in the audience. The story that the Chinese Communist Party tells of itself, its narrative, is constructed really from the 1840s onwards. I'll start with that point because when Xi Jinping became the General Secretary of the Communist Party of China in November 2012, as you know, it was followed by him becoming the President of China in March 2013, and subsequently, as I've said, the chairman of everything in the months thereafter. He made a number of profound and important statements about Chinese history, the China story, and Chinese time that I'm now going to introduce you to. He talked about a number of things. One, he came into power, and the first day he was in power, he declared that it was his aim, or the aim of his period of rule, which nominally is a 10-year period. People think that most Chinese leaders now have 2 goes at being head of the party. It's 2 periods of 5, making it 10 years. I think Xi Jinping is that kind of guy that he might want a little bit more, but I'm perhaps getting ahead of myself there. He declared that he would oversee a China that would realize or start realizing the China dream. The China dream, on one level, being the dream to see China as a nation revitalized, vibrant, and important again. This is summed up in the slogan, 中华民族伟大的复兴, the great revitalization or renaissance of the Chinese nation. So he declared that this is what part of the China dream was. Now, I would just very quickly say every part of that statement's problematic. So, Fuxing is a Western word introduced to China from Japan. Fukko, Japanese word introduced in the 1870s or 80s. It's renaissance or rebirth or revitalization. So it's not a nativist Chinese term. It's a modern concept that you can revitalize or revivify. The usual way it's done is by dynastic change over Chinese history. When one leadership, one dynastic house is regarded as being corrupt, incompetent, incapable of ruling, no longer having the moral right to rule, it collapses, another leader arises, declares they have the moral virtue on their side to take over, and they establish a new dynasty with all the types of ideas related to that. So China is trying to revitalize under a one-party state. The 中华民族, the China nation, or the people of China that it speaks of, this is an invention of the late 19th century. 中华 means China. Let me just write it up. Zhonghua. I don't use those communist characters. They're too ugly. So Hua. It's also Hua is the character that we use for the logo of our center. It's our sort of trademark. In the hand of Huai Su, if you're familiar, Tang Dynasty monk, Chairman Mao emulated him in his calligraphy. Zhonghua is a concept of centralized place that flourishes. China, Zhongguo, was not really spoken of as China until the 1860s or so. We'll talk about why that was the case. And 中华民族 is an invention. There's no such thing as a China is Chinese race. China has over 50 ethnic groups in it, all who identify with different languages, cultures, and customs. There's a mainstream group that call themselves the Han people. The Han, H-A-N people, is itself an invention. Again, my colleague Mark Elliott, who made himself so very unpopular with the new Qing history debate, as I mentioned earlier. He's written a wonderful essay on this subject. You can download it online, which is about, and the essay is called, let's got it here, Hushuo, H-U-S-H-U-O. Hushuo means both to speak rubbish, but also means to speak about Hu, barbarians, the northern other, and the naming of the Han Chinese. This is in a book called Critical Han Studies. The book is available online. You can download the PDF of this essay. And it looks at how the word Han came to be used. In fact, it's a river, the name of a river, and invading northern peoples in the 3rd and 4th century called the people they were invading, those people near the Han River, Hanren. And that's how the concept of the Han, which is now regarded as being the word for Chinese people, came about. It then disappeared from about the 5th century AD until about the 13th, 14th century, during the Mongol Yuan dynasty, which I showed you earlier. And in the Ming dynasty, it reappeared because of other invading groups. So the Han people were named by the other, by invaders, in contrast to themselves. So this, again, the belief that there's some unified Chinese race that has bloodlines that lead back 5,000 years, that's an unchanging national identity. This is all modern creation. This is the creation of introduction of Western ideas about race, about place, about country, about empire, about peoples. Don't be fooled. Let's take it on board, understand it. All your Chinese friends will argue with you and tell you you're an appalling foreign barbarian who doesn't understand anything and you're completely ignorant. However, as I've said before, there are provable facts. We know what happened when, how things came about. And if you're interested in knowing about China and understanding, not being fooled by a translated China, that is a pre-packaged China that is fed to you so you accept ideas of the party state and its economic and political priorities. If you don't want to be fooled by all of that stuff, then go and do some reading. If you want to be, you can be fooled by it, but at least be aware that there are ways of finding out what really happened and what's going on. Anyway, Xi Jinping comes in the past and says revitalization of the Chinese people. Fantastic, nothing wrong with that. But as I said, you're underpinning many of your great aims on the basis of fallacy. That's where I have a problem with. I'm a historian. I'm interested in reality as well as interpretation. I'm interested in narrative as well as fact. And the two can often clash. So he comes into power in November. He then takes the Politburo, the newly selected 7-man, all men, Politburo, all, as you would note, all with the same beautiful dark hair and nice red ties. He takes them all off immediately to the Tiananmen Square. On the eastern side of Tiananmen Square is the Chinese National History Museum, and he takes to show them an exhibition about the road to revitalization. It's a study of the Chinese narrative from 1840 to now, China's road to revivalism. Now, this is the narrative I'm talking about. So I'll say a bit more about that in a moment. So he talks about the China dream, revitalization of the Chinese nation, and this narrative. He then talks about two other timescapes that are very relevant to you understanding where the One Belt, One Road and all these other things fit in. Because these are the underpinnings of his period of rule. He's been in power 2.5, soon 3 years. He's got another at least 7 years to go. The two other timescapes he mentions in the following months after coming to power in November 2012 are the two 30 years. It's called 前后30年, the first 30 years and the second 30 years. And we'll talk about these in a bit of detail in a moment. The first 30 years is the period from 1949 to 1978. That is the 30 years during which the Maoist, Mao Zedong's political line and the general ideology of class struggle and politics above all else, and building the nation as a Soviet-style, mass movement-oriented, revolutionary entity held sway. This is the basic 30 years when the People's Republic was founded. Its basic political, cultural, and intellectual parameters were determined during the Mao Zedong period. So it's the first 30 years of the People's Republic. The whole 30年, the second 30 years, is the era of so-called reform, when the Communist Party in 1978, December 78, formally abandons class struggle and its original Marxist-Leninist philosophy of class struggle as being the basis for social change in favor of economic construction. It does so in 78, and in the early 80s introduces a policy of open door and reform, i.e. putting economic construction and development at the very heart of all national activity. This latter period is called the second 30 years that lasts from 78 till 2008, to the Olympic year. and really to the period when gradually Xi Jinping and his colleagues will gradually move towards coming into power. So Xi Jinping comes and he speaks of the 前后30年. This is a debate that's been had long before Xi comes into power. And he, unlike many others, he says there's no fundamental contradiction between the two. The first 30 years establish the basis for everything that happens thereafter. So by saying that, and then talking about it quite frequently, he basically says no more debate about the types of changes that others have speculated about in recent years. We are cut from a Maoist cloth, and that's where we're going to continue to be. So it clearly states basically that we are of a peace. And I'll talk about what the ramifications of this are very, very serious in terms of civil rights, in terms of law reform, in terms of the media, in terms of the internet, in terms of economic debate, in terms of foreign policy. What happens with the 230 years, it's a historian's debate, but the effect of Xi Jinping talking about it in the way he has is profound in every major area of Chinese life. It has direct and practical implications for any of you who are interested in China today. The third aspect of Chinese time that Xi Jinping discusses after coming to power is the two centenaries. 2个100年. So, the two centenaries, to go back in time just a bit, in 2009, which is the 50th anniversary, was it 60th anniversary of the founding of the People's Republic of China. At that time, the leadership under Hu Jintao, former President, Party Secretary of China, a number of people advised, we're reaching 2009, it's a major watershed, the 60th anniversary, it's a jiazi, the Chinese traditional calendar, it's one round of 60 years. Chinese time is calculated in cycles of 60 years, it's one jiazi, 60-year period. We should calibrate how we see the future. Some people advise the Politburo, very influential thinkers, well, many people advise them. So people are constantly sending advice papers to the Politburo and others to try and influence the way the party talks about itself, thinks about itself, articulates its aims. One group, very powerful group, said, we believe that one-party rule in China is not sustainable over the long term. We suggest that when the party celebrates the 60th anniversary of the People's Republic, it declare two centennial goals. One, 2021, which will mark the centenary, the 100 years since the founding of the Communist Party of China in 1921, we declare that our basic goal of creating a strong, independent, and moderately prosperous, 小康社会, a moderately prosperous China, be declared, and therefore the basic program of the Communist Party of China will have been realized. So 基本纲领, the basic program of the Communist Party will have been realized by 2021, and we should declare victory. We've done what we said we'd do. We've been through a lot of difficulty. There have been lots of problems, blah, blah, blah. However, China is now strong, independent, blah, blah. The next centenary, i.e., from 2021 to 2049 will mark the centenary, 100 years since the founding of the People's Republic of China. We should move towards political reform and the democratization of China in keeping with the new democracy policies announced by Chairman Mao in the 1940s and as part of all the promises we made as a Communist Party from 1946 to 1949 during the Civil War period. When the Communist Party, and you can look it up, there's a great book called 历史的先声, The Voices of History. It's available online, it's in Chinese, sadly. It contains in it, published in 1999, contains in it all of the major speeches, interviews, and articles by Mao, Liu Shaoqi, his deputy, Zhou Enlai, the future Premier of China, and many other communist leaders regarding how the Communist Party would bring to China democracy, i.e. one man, one vote democracy, multi-party, bicameral democracy, that's what they promised, human rights, basic protection of human rights, freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, and so on and so forth, judicial independence, media openness, etc., etc. All of these promises were made in the 1940s by the Communist Party. Pity they've forgotten them. They were, however, all put into a nice volume on the time of the 50th anniversary of the People's Republic of China by a very good friend of mine, who will rename, she uses a pen name to edit the volume, but it's, as I said, it's available online. Anyway, this group argued our second centenary goal for 2049 should be the realization of all the promises we made to the Chinese people, which, after all, led China's intellectuals to support us in the 40s and helped us get us into power. We have made these promises repeatedly. We can now realize them. So this is one of the many advice papers given to the authorities in 2009. Now, that didn't happen, obviously. What has happened, however, is that Xi Jinping and his colleagues did take up the idea of the two centennial aims, and they have now enshrined it in party policy. So Xi Jinping, coming to power, Chinese dream, revitalization of the Chinese nation, the great narration from 1840 onwards, one thing, the 230 years, reconciling the Maoist era with the reformist era, the third being the two centennial goals. We've got a narrative not only about the past, but about where we're going to be in 2021, 2049. 2021, under Xi Jinping, we will realize a level of moderate prosperity for the country. And 小康社会, they call it. Now, China, being a nation, like any Marxist-Leninist nation influenced by neoliberalism, is a nation of statistics and detail. You can go and look up online every single performance indicator, every KPI, key performance indicator, that will indicate that China has reached a relative level of prosperity by 2021. It's all written up, it's all outlined in great, lugubrious detail. Now, the second centennial goal is summed up as China being a country that is democratic, harmonious, wealthy, and strong, but socialist, i.e., we will have all of those things. We'll be democratic, socialist, strong, wealthy, with Chinese socialist characteristics, i.e., cut all the way with all the bullshit. Socialist characteristics means one-party rule with an unelected and selected leadership of elites controlling what is and isn't good for the Chinese people. And I know there's much, you read Zhang Weiwei, who's, I've given you a link to an interview done by Didi Kirsten, as I mentioned earlier, in which he argues that we have a superior system. We have this wonderful electorate plus selectorate, so we get the very best of the best. Daniel Bell, this clownish political scientist, this fellow traveler of the Communist Party who teaches political science at Tsinghua University, he has written a recent book and he argues endlessly about the power and significance and meaning of Chinese meritocracy. Okay, so the individual is crushed, the marginal are ignored, the disempowered are trodden over, ethnic minorities are treated like crap. Doesn't matter. The society as a whole is getting better, and therefore this collateral damage is just the grindings of the great wheels of history. It's nearly always men, sometimes women, who love these great forces of history and can predict where things are going, and that they're at the head of the very tip of modern change and development, and they like to be on the side of the winners. I'm not so interested in that. I'm interested personally, sorry, this is a complete sideline, I'm interested in how a society, and I don't live in a society that does this well. I'm not pretending that this is not we're good, they're bad scenario. How a society deals with the marginalized, the deprived, the persecuted, the dispossessed. Our society can't even cope with a few thousand refugees coming on leaky boats, let alone deal with its Aboriginal population, let alone deal with disaffected Muslim youth. I mean, we're completely screwed up. China has similar problems. Therefore, when one talks of the superior model and all these types of things and all the big boosters of a China or booster of the China model, personally I'm interested in seeing how our society deals with the messy bits at the borders of society, and those who aren't all winners in the great economic developmental mode of things. Those of you who've read the recent encyclical by Pope Francis, and I'm not by any means a papist, as Giovanni well knows, I'm absolutely completely anti-Catholic in many ways. Nonetheless, he touches on many things that are very cogent and relevant to this type of discussion. So Xi Jinping and his mates, they're interested in having a democratic, wealthy, powerful, and harmonious China that is suffused with socialist characteristics. Now, 具有中国社会主义特色, this phrase, to have Chinese socialist characteristics, was invented by Chinese party propagandists in the early 1980s to justify policies under Deng Xiaoping, Hu Yaobang, and Zhao Ziyang, three leaders of the 1980s, to justify all their radical betrayals of Mao Zedong thought and Mao Zedong philosophy. Socialism with Chinese characteristics is used to justify, it's the ultimate grab-all category that allows the government to justify any policy move it makes. Brilliant, absolute genius. Absolutely vacuous, meaningless, but brilliant, because what can you say? If you read the newspapers and see when Chinese people denounce foreigners for not understanding China, say, you don't understand that China is a socialist country with Chinese characteristics, meaning it is what our government says. Yeah, it's cute. So just be aware, this is another element of translated China. And you end up, as we know, with a neoliberal Marxist-Leninist Maoist society that's really about entrenching elite power and control. It's benefited huge numbers of people, but nonetheless, its aims are to stay in power itself and to determine China's future as well as rewrite its history in its own favor.